Hello, everybody, and looks like the Atlantic Division is going to be a bloodbath this year. Obviously, it's going to be really a tight race between those top four teams, between Toronto, Florida, Boston now, and Tampa Bay. And with the moves from the other three teams, as a Leafs fan, I was saying, man, when is Toronto going to make a move? Kyle Dubas, you got to do something. And he's done it. And he's made two moves in a span of a couple minutes, 30 minutes really, to an hour. Um, and, the one that we're going to talk about primarily for this video is the Travis Dermott trade. Obviously, the big name that Toronto's bringing in is Mark Giordano and Colin Blackwell, but, you know, that move is going to take a while before we get all the details for it. While for this trade, we already know what's going to happen. So it's been known, for like a good week or two now that, this up to the trade deadline would probably be the last time we saw Travis Dermott in a Toronto Maple Leafs jersey. Um, he's really been Toronto's eighth defenseman this season when we've been healthy, right? We've got Riley, Lyubushkin who got brought in, and then we had Muzzin with Hall, and then we had Brody, obviously, as well as the two young guys in Sandin and Liljegren, who Dermott was really fighting for, playing time with. And we've seen as time has gone on and on that Dermott has been shelved more frequently than not. And I think even he knew this was likely going to happen throughout the season, which is why before the season started, reportedly he'd asked for a trade. Um, and now we know Travis Dermott has been moved to the Vancouver Canucks in exchange for Winnipeg's third round pick that Vancouver owns. So likely that's going to be a mid third round pick. Either way, I don't think, there's a huge discrepancy. But, Travis Dermott, he's a good player. He's only 24 years old. I think defensively, he's good. I think that, at times, he'll be caught out of position. He'll make a couple bad plays. He's very aggressive. He's very physical for despite his slightly smaller stature. He plays with a lot of heart, which is something that if you told a Leafs fan 5, 6, 7 years ago, it's like, oh, you got a 24-year-old defenseman who wants to be in Toronto, who gives it all, who can play on the left, who can play on the right, and we're trading him, they would have called you crazy, right? But the reality is he didn't have a spot on this blue line. Right now he's playing on the right side, but only because Liljegren has options to move up and down and to get waived without passing through waivers, which is why they had to do that in order to accommodate the big trade with Mark Giordano to clear up cap space, right? He's playing right now because Jake Muzzin is hurt and he's not on the ice, right? Those are two guys that would normally be playing over him that aren't in the lineup for whatever reason, not based on performance, right? There's a reason he wasn't in the Heritage. He was scratched for the Heritage Classic game, um, and with this move, Toronto gets a third round pick, which we didn't have anymore because of previous moves that we've made while trying to win. And that's important because with the Giordano Blackwell trade, I expect that we've heard that there were multiple picks involved. So, if we're being optimistic, we say Toronto's trading 2 seconds, maybe an extra fourth for some other retention. But realistically, there's going to be picks in the first two rounds that get moved. I don't know if it's a first round pick. I don't know if it's multiple second round picks, but getting more picks is important. And we've seen how much Toronto has been able to do the past couple of years in that second to third round pick range, right? We got Matthew Neese last year in the second round. We had Topi Niemela and Ronnie Hervlim in the second and third round the year before that, right? This team knows how to draft in that second to third round range. Rasmus Sandin was a very late first, I believe. So, Toronto thrives in terms of they have good faith in their draft department, which is why I think they're okay with giving up, a first round pick the past couple of years because they're confident that they can get first round value based on what their scouts can bring to the table. With a guy like Travis Dermott, the Leafs have guys that they think in a couple of years can replace what Travis Dermott brings, right? Topi Niemela at least Leafs fans are hoping, can become much better than Travis Dermott ever was. Um, and I think Dermott's a good player. I don't want to bash on Dermott. I don't want to make it seem like, oh, thank God he's gone. A third round pick. We got away with high robbery. No. I think a third round pick is around what we could have gotten for Dermott. And I don't think there is a much better spot for a guy like Travis Dermott to land outside of Vancouver. There's a couple teams that maybe you can look at. Maybe Seattle. A lot of people thought he was going back in that trade. Maybe Dermott would be able to get a role there. But Vancouver's a team that really, really, really needs youth on that blue line. You can see that, we got the cap friendly or the daily line combos for the Vancouver Canucks blue line, right? OEL's not going anywhere. Obviously, he's getting paid too much money. He's got way too much term left. He's going to play that left side. Same with Tyler Myers. Unless they can find a team that's willing to take his contract or if they're willing to eat a part of his salary, he's going to be there, right? And Quinn Hughes is obviously their franchise cornerstone. But outside of that, there are 3 roster spots, one of which is in the top 4, where there is no certainty. And it's not like, Vancouver has a lot of great defensive prospects that are coming up that are like 23, 22, 24 years old that can step into that top 4 role. And the great thing about Travis Dermott is his left-right defensive flexibility, right? Part of that is what has kept him in the roster at points this season. If he was a guy who could only play on the left side, I can promise you Travis Dermott would not be playing, would not have played many games for the Leafs this year. The fact that he played over 40 games this year is because of his flexibility and his ability to play the right side. And, obviously Luke Shen is great, but by the deadline, I do expect Vancouver is probably going to move him for value. Or they're going to find someone like a John Moreno to take over that role. But regardless, Dermott is in the position where he can compete for a top 4 role on this blue line. Whereas in Toronto, after the moves that the Leafs made, that was never really an option. And going back to this Toronto blue line now, you look at Travis Dermott's gone. Realistically, Morgan Riley and Ilya Lyubushkin, I think the Leafs really, I think Sheldon Keefe and the Leafs coaching staff really like that top pair. And obviously with the introduction of Mark Giordano, you have to assume the second pair is going to be Giordano and Brody. I don't think they're going to split that pair apart. Though that pairing was so good for Calgary in 2017, which I believe was the year that Giordano had a heart level season. And then Rasmus Sandin is obviously, like, Toronto's not going to move Sandin to the minors. Sandin's got a spot on this playoff roster, which begs the question, when Jake Muzzin comes back, what happens to Justin Hall or Timothy Liljegren? Because one of those two are already not going to be playing once Giordano gets here, right? One of those guys is going to have to get scratched. It's probably going to be Justin Hall, because I think Liljegren's been the much better player of the two, and he's younger, and I think Toronto wants to develop him. So Justin Hall is your 7th defenseman now. When Jake Muzzin comes back, you'd have to try Muzzin and Sandin, right? So if that's the case, what then happens to Justin Hall? Because Liljegren then becomes your seventh defenseman, who's your depth guy, who's a very good depth guy. And then you have Justin Hall, who's making $2 million against the cap, and he's not really bringing much to your team, right? Like, I'd rather Toronto move Hall and get someone that's cheaper, that brings what Hall brings, like a Luke Shen or, even a Ben Hutton type, right? Even though he's obviously just signed a contract, so Toronto wouldn't be trading for him. But someone like that doesn't cost $2 million against the cap. And you look at this Toronto lineup now, right? Like, looking forward, obviously we don't know what Toronto's giving up quite yet for Giordano and Blackwell, but I would assume that we know that there isn't going to be a second team for retention. So let's just say that Seattle, retains 50% of Giordano's contract. He's making 3.375. This is what the team's going to look like, right? You got to move Hall out, right? Try to clear that $2 million cap space. Jack Campbell's obviously going to come back off IR eventually. But you look at this forward core and you go, this is good, right? You got the big 4, and that's what makes it elite. Michael Bunting has been playing incredible. But what is really missing here? And what's really missing is one more top flight, top 6 forward, right? And this is where I think when they mentioned that Colin Blackwell was going to be involved in this trade, where my interest was piqued, right? Because Blackwell could just be a depth guy, a guy they put on the taxi squad, a guy they send down to the minors or they'll let go, but I don't think so because I think Colin Blackwell has actually been really, really good, especially defensively this season for Seattle. And he's a guy that fits that fourth line role perfectly. He can win faceoffs. He's another guy that he not necessarily can put on the penalty kill, but a guy you can trust in late game situations. And it allows you. And Jason Spezza is really good at faceoffs too, right? So you have those two guys that can kind of interchange with each other that have center wing flexibility, and center depth is incredibly important, right? Um, but with this addition of Blackwell, who's only making 725K, you got to ask what's going to happen with Alex Kerfoot, right? Because, he's a guy who was started the season on the line with Tavares and Nylander, and, the last couple weeks, he's been playing on that fourth line, and he was having a good season up to that point, but you can't pay a guy $3.5 million to play on your fourth line. You just can't. And Sheldon Keefe, I think, has really found something with that third line. He tried this last year with Hyman, Mikheyev, and Engvall, and it didn't really work because Engvall didn't really have what it takes to be a full shutdown third line center, right? Which is why David Kampf was brought in, and David Kampf has provided that. He's been incredible this season for Toronto. I'm so glad he signed for another year. But Engvall on the wing has actually been very good because he doesn't have quite the defensive responsibilities. He's also not quite the face-off man that David Kampf is. And you look at that unit, that third line that's been so good the last couple weeks. Where are they? They got two tall, fast guys in Mikheyev and Engvall, and they have a guy in Kampf who's very good in the small areas of the ice in terms of making those quick bumper transition passes, very responsible defensively. I think that third line isn't going to get touched. I don't think Keefe wants to break it up, and I think Dubas is looking at that line and saying, that's a cheap third line that works. It does what it needs to do, and it's effective. And with Blackwell, Spezza, and Simmons, that's a really good fourth line, right? And you can bring guys, and it gives Keefe flexibility on his roster with a guy like Blackwell because Wayne Simmons is obviously on the older side and Spezza as well. So if you want to load manage them, Blackwell can step into the lineup while they take the night off. In different playoff matches, if you need a little bit more scoring, because don't forget Andre Kasha is still here, right? Kasha's a guy who's playing on that second line, but if you move Kerfoot for like a top six forward with picks. Kasha's a guy who can play with Spezza and Simmons, or Spezza and Blackwell, or Simmons and Blackwell, right? It offers a lot of different lineup flexibilities. And Alex Kerfoot's been a really good player for Toronto. He's not Nazem Kadri, right? And he's the only piece left from that trade, and he's a really good penalty killer for this team. But again, $3.5 million is just a little bit too much for a guy that doesn't have a top six role on this team. And if you're gonna pay Matthews, Marner, Tavares that much money, you can't afford to pay bottom six players $3.5 million. You just can't. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he gets moved. And I really don't think Dubas is done making moves because there's too many holes in this roster. In terms of the glaring one's goalie. And I don't know if, Toronto is going to make a huge move because it's clear Peter Mrazek is not that guy. And he's so much not that guy, even though he's on waivers, I don't think anyone is going to claim him off waivers, right? So are you really believing that Eric Shalgren can be that guy if Jack Campbell can't return to form? Or are you going to make a push for a guy like James Reimer, right? And if you are, Kerfoot's gonna go the other way, maybe, right? Like that's a possibility, and yet you have to figure. And Dubas is gonna have to figure things out because this is a tough year to go for it, especially with the playoff format and especially with how loaded the Atlantic Division is this year. But Tavares isn't getting any younger, right? This team is not getting any younger. A lot of these guys are kicking into their primes. You gotta find a way to win. You gotta figure out a way to get past the first round. And I'm going to be honest, even with these two moves, bringing Giordano and Blackwell, I don't think this team's good enough. So it's going to be interesting. I don't want to talk too much into it because when the Giordano details come out, me and Q will be back here. We'll be making another video on the Giordano trade, and we'll go more in depth in terms of what Toronto really should do. Given when we have a better idea of what the asset cupboard looks like. But yeah, all the best to Travis Dermott. I think he's going to be really good for Vancouver. I think he's going to take that next step. And, maybe in a couple of years, people will look back on that trade and say, Travis Dermott, Leafs got fleeced. Travis Dermott's a legit top four defenseman, and Toronto only got a third round pick. But, I think it's the right move, not just for the Leafs, but for Travis Dermott. I think he needs a change in scenery, and I think he can be really good in Vancouver. So, yeah, that's all. And we'll keep you updated throughout the entire trade deadline process. We're going to be having a live stream on trade deadline day. So make sure to go check that out. And we'll see you guys next time.